Welcome, everyone. Welcome. We are the new MDs. We are so happy to be with you today. I'm very proud to be able to introduce this powerhouse panel that we have today. And not only powerhouse, but some of the nicest people on the planet. I have to say, some of the most generous and genuine women that I am honored to know. My name is Zen Honeycutt. I am the founder and director of Moms Across America and the author of Unstoppable: Transforming Sickness and Struggle into Triumph, Empowerment, and a Celebration of Hope. And we next have Stephanie Seneff. She is a senior research scientist at MIT and author of Toxic Legacy: How the Weed Killer Glyphosate is Destroying Our Health and the Environment. Michelle Perot is a board certified pediatric doctor, homeopath, author, and the CEO of the nonprofit organization GMOscience.org. And she is the sponsor of this program. She's also the author of What's Making Our Children Sick. And she's going to be following up with a book called What's Making Our Children Well, which we can't wait for. And our special guest today, this is the first time ever we have done this. We have Beth Lambert. She's the author of a book called A Compromised Generation. And it is one of the first books that I read 11 years ago to learn about why my children were sick. So I'm very grateful to have her on the show. She's also an educator and founder and executive director of Epidemic Answers and Documenting Hope. So we are so excited to have you with us, Beth, and you get to have all three of us asking you questions and for us to have a conversation about how to make our children well and what you're doing right now, documenting the hope, the journey of children who are recovering from autism, ADHD, and pandas. And we're gonna talk all about that and dive into it. But can we just get started with having you talk about really why autism as the main focus for our children?
Yeah, I think autism is kind of the big signal or the big noise that something's wrong with our children. I mean, we have the vast majority of American children, and certainly children in the Western world, that have some kind of health condition, whether it's a developmental condition or a chronic illness. But kids with autism are impacted, I think, with the greatest spectrum of symptoms and the greatest depth of issues that they have to deal with. But the interesting thing about autism is that if you can understand the root causes of autism, why these children are developing the symptoms they are, what precipitates the various sensory issues, or what precipitates the language problems, you can actually understand all of these chronic conditions, whether it's an autoimmune condition like celiac disease or rheumatoid arthritis, or whether it's asthma, allergies, and even life-threatening food allergies. They're all related, and they all share common root causes that really are about what's in the environment and what's changed in the environment. So that's why I think autism is such an important thing for us to focus on, because it is a problem that is going to really challenge us in terms of how we care for people with autism who can't live independently. But it's also the opportunity, if we can understand autism, we can understand all these other chronic conditions and how to keep our children well. So that's really what the focus is about.
Excellent. Thank you. And I think Stephanie had a question for you.
Yeah, well, when I first watched autism rates going up in the early 2000s, every year more. And then we're just diagnosing it more. Always we're just diagnosing it more. We really don't have a problem. And I wondered if you could comment on that theory and whether you think that's correct. And if not, what's going on?
Yeah, so the CDC just came out with numbers. They just have their updated numbers. Every couple of years, they update their autism prevalence numbers. And so now they're saying it's 1 in 36 children with an autism spectrum disorder, which we know doesn't actually even account for the kids who are below 8 years old, because you're looking in those numbers at school-age children. So, one of the things that, doesn't quite add up is if you think about the US population, if we're just looking at the US, for instance, do we have 1 in 36 adults with an autism spectrum disorder? And of those, 90% don't live independently, right? So that's how we're looking at the first generation large generation of children with autism growing up into adulthood, and what they're capable of in terms of their ability to live independently, hold jobs. We have statistics on all that now. So you cannot look at American society and say 1 in 36 American adults has autism and 90% can't live independently, or continue to carry a job or all of those things. So the logic here breaks down. And there's also been epidemiological studies done showing that this is a frank increase. This isn't just better diagnosis. I mean, we are better at diagnosing. That's actually true, but it does not account for the meteoric rate of autism, going from 3 in 10,000 kids in 1970 being diagnosed with autism to 1 in 36. And actually, my scientist that works on our research studies looked at those rates over the years and how every 2 years or so, when the CDC comes out with their new data, they usually correct and say, okay, well, in 2008, it's 1 in 150. And then they go back and look at it and say, actually, in 2008, it was really 1 in 68. So they go back and they correct the numbers. And so if you're looking at 1 in 36 today, they're likely going to correct it in a couple of years to something closer to 1 in 31 or 1 in 30. So this is a major crisis. And we need to start treating it as such, or else we're going to be in trouble as a country. We're not going to be able to sustain this kind of, this population that can't live on their own.
And thank you for that. And Michelle, you had a question for Beth?
Well, so many questions for Beth. Certainly by definition, these numbers are truly the definition of an epidemic. And because it is indeed global, it's a pandemic. So we are really dealing with a real pandemic of childhood disorders. And Stephanie, like you, I as well in the early 2000s, literally stood up in my seat and said, what the heck is going on? And a quick shout out to Stephanie. I remember looking at one of your graphs you produced, I think it was approximately 2012, and correct me if I'm wrong, predicting autism would be about one in 2 kids in 2025.
2032.
2032.
Yes, thank you. And I thought, oh my gosh. But sure enough, it was happening in the clinic. So Beth, back to you. So what is happening in the pediatric community? Personally, the fact that we don't diagnose kids on the spectrum until 2 to 3 years old to me is shocking, because as a clinician, it is not the most difficult diagnosis to make. Mm-hmm. I think many grandparents could diagnose kids with autism. Of course, it's a spectrum, with some kids being very mild and obviously more severe. And that always just bugged me to no end, that it took so long to get kids recognized, diagnosed, into programs, et cetera. But so,
Michelle, can I jump in there for a second, though?
Please.
Wouldn't that be the case because most kids aren't getting autism or autism-like symptoms until 2 or 3 because of the inundation of toxins that happen at the age of birth and, going forward?
It's around 15 months, but clearly to 18 months. In my clinical opinion, Beth, you can weigh in too. I was saying it earlier, I've diagnosed kids as young as 4 months. Wow. Believe it or not, you can see because of the social contact issues. Babies are extremely responsive. They're not like a piece of clay. They're this very emotive creatures. They're wonderful, and they can shift right away. You just have to be aware of what they're doing. So Beth, what do you think is happening in the pediatric community? I'm a pediatrician. I'd rather hear from you. Where, why, how, what's your sense of what's going on in the pediatric world? Clearly there's a disconnect.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things I wanted to respond to that you just mentioned is, diagnosing as early as 4 months. The autism diagnosis has been subjective, right? So it sometimes takes a little while until the child is at school age, and maybe then they start picking up deficits. And again, it's a spectrum. So you have severely impacted kids, moderately impacted kids, and kids who sort of pass and then get the diagnosis later. And you're seeing this happen increasingly now as you're getting adults who have passed their whole life and now are getting this diagnosis, which I think is an interesting phenomenon. But actually, if you look at some of the literature that's coming out, and there are some companies that are even stepping into this, is you can actually detect the likelihood of a child developing autism based on some actual objective criteria. So, things like oxidative stress, things like nervous system dysregulation. There was actually a study where Dr. Martha Herbert, who used to be our principal investigator, she retired. I know you know her well, Stephanie. I think you know her. Everybody probably knows her as well. She did a study where she was infants as young as 8 weeks old, and she could predict to some degree whether they would develop autism or not. So there are signs and markers and things that we can actually find in children early on that will predict their likelihood to develop autism. There's actually a company called BioRosa right now, which has an objective diagnostic, a blood-based diagnostic, where you can actually, right, how's that possible? And to your point, Zen, isn't autism something that's cumulative and develops over time? And that's the answer to that is yes, that autism is cumulative. And you could actually make an argument that it starts preconception and prenatally, right? And it's what autism is, and all of these conditions are really a function of a series of stressors that hit our kids one after another, after another, after another over time. So when I say, autism or any kind of chronic condition, you can go back to preconception because the mother's bodies and the father's bodies are toxic. You have gut imbalances in both mom and dad. You have all kinds of gene mutations that are making their way through and becoming relevant. So you take that infant who's already predisposed to a toxic load because of mom and dad, and then they go through pregnancy where they're exposed to another layer of toxicity. And that could be in our food, on our personal care products, the pharmaceuticals that are exposed to, the vaccines that they get in utero. That child comes out into the world with a full bucket of toxic load. Plus, they have their immune system all dysregulated. That's just how they're coming into the world. And so whether they develop autism or whether they develop an autoimmune disease or eczema or allergies, it really depends on a whole variety of variables, including genetics, including the particular environmental assaults that they experienced and at what time in their developmental trajectory. So sometimes you see kids who are developing normally, right? For the first 6, 8, 12 months, and then all of a sudden they start regressing. Or this happens, like you said, Michelle, at 15 months or 18 months, you start seeing a regression. Well, what's that about? That's a really interesting phenomenon that not enough people have done studies on. Why would a kid develop typically and then all of a sudden regress? So again, I think that we're still unraveling, what's going on with autism, but we have a lot of clues. We have a lot of information about things that are correlated with worse health outcomes. Things like they've looked at. I remember going to a fundraiser once for the I think it was Environmental Working Group, Healthy Child, Healthy World, and somebody there was trying to say it's BPA. It's BPA causing autism because some studies came out that showed a correlation between BPA and autism. And I was like, yes, it is BPA, but it's antibiotics and vaccines and glyphosate and all the toxins. It's never one thing. It's a cumulative and synergistic total load of stressors that are just part of living in the modern world. And our kids who are these tiny little bodies, they cannot withstand and tolerate that kind of stressor load. So that's when they start developing symptoms, whether it's, again, eczema or behavioral symptoms, sensory symptoms. It's just a little body that is just too overloaded with environmental assaults.
Can I just jump on there? One thing you said, Beth, and I just want to remind everybody and our listeners as well, that children in general do not detoxify as well as adults for several reasons. Number one is they may not have the main enzyme system for detoxification of liver. It's called PON1. Some kids never develop it. 2, their livers may not be able to handle the toxic load. 3, their microbiome is also their first line of defense, and we can get into that microbiome. How can we not? Then we can launch there in detoxification. And they have their ratio of increased absorption is different than adults. There are not many adults. Their weights are different. You could have a kid who's 20 pounds versus a 160 to 180 pound adult, very different. And, so I love this toxic load that we're finally addressing it. It's like the straw that broke the camel's back. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you can hold it up, but so high. And remember, and this is for families who have 2, 3, 4, or 5 kids. 4 kids could be normal and 1 is not, because every kid has different genetics and genetic SNPs, also called epigenetics. But we'll get back on track here and we'll get back on some questions. I just wanted to bring that in about kids are not many adults. So we have to remind ourselves of that.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate that. I just want to just show an image too of what somebody explained to me before about total toxic burden. If you had, a cup of chemicals that kids are exposed to in their body care products and their shampoos, right? And you or a tablespoon of that, and you poured that in here. And then the food dyes that they're eating in Twizzlers and Cheetos and all, you poured the food dyes in here. If you poured processed sugar in here, then that, and then antibiotics and heavy metals and BPA and glyphosate, right? And aluminum from vaccines, all these different things. Eventually this cup would overflow And you wouldn't be able to say it was just glyphosate, right? Which I have been screaming about, or it's just BPA, or it's the combination. That's the total toxic burden that would overflow that cup. And that's what would have, if for the most part, kids having, loss of eye contact and gut dysbiosis and erratic behavior and their gut microbiome destroyed. And that's what happened to my son when he was 8. So that's why, Michelle, I asked you about, it's a cumulative, for him, it was a cumulative effect of many different toxins he was partially vaccinated. He was exposed to GMOs and glyphosate. He was exposed to all those other things I just mentioned to you. There's heavy metals in baby food now, even organic baby food. So, and there's lawsuits out about that now. So there's that cumulative effects. And that's what we're talking about today, is the toxic burden. And then, yes, I believe, Stephanie, you had a question for Beth.
Well, yeah, she's kind of answering it, but sort of what does she think are the most important factors that these kids are exposed to that are causing these problems? And I know that you've had a lot of experience with autistic kids and their parents and trying to clean up their environment. What have been the successes in terms of what you've eliminated, sort of your Documenting Hope project, to get into that, and what you've learned from your observations from these parents and their children?
Yeah, there's no one pathway to autism. That it's, as Michelle, you were alluding to earlier, it depends on, what your genetics are and what you're exposed to, but it's the total load again that is what, what's the common denominator. But at the same time, even though I know what you just described, Zen, about this barrel of, assaults going in, and it's, it's really just—
Can you show that again, Anne, please?
Build up. Yeah. So, this is sort of a way of understanding how our kids are so vulnerable right now, why they're developing these symptoms and diagnoses. But I came into this world with a lens looking at the microbiome, and really feeling like that was the most important piece here. And I have spent 15 years trying to understand and unravel what's going on with our kids. And I'm still coming back to the microbiome and its importance. I think it is the most important piece in this puzzle, because essentially living in the modern world, just eating, not organic foods and being exposed to the chemicals that are around, and conventional pharmaceuticals like proton pump inhibitors and antibiotics and all these things that people have they just do by living in this culture, you destroy your microbiome. And Michelle, you had alluded to it earlier about how the microbiome is your first line of defense and helps you detoxify. And that's absolutely true. So if you have, a microbiome that you've had a couple rounds of antibiotics, and you're not going to be able to detoxify those heavy metals that are in the baby food. If you've had proton pump inhibitors, which upset the balance of the pH in the gut, then you're going to, alter what grows in your microbiome. And then maybe the ones that are great at detoxifying, or that help you extract vitamins from your gut, from the food, they're not going to be there anymore. So that's really, to me, the most important piece, but it's not the whole picture. It's never the whole picture. And Stephanie, you asked about, what I've learned along the journey too. We launched a research project called Documenting Hope, where we have 2 IRB approved studies. One is looking at the environmental variables that our children are exposed to in modern living, and how those variables correlate with health outcomes. And there's 2 main takeaways that I can say we are drawing out of that study. That study is called the CHIRP study. And the first takeaway is that total load is actually a thing. So we have kids who have whose parents come in and they fill out a massive survey. It's over 900 questions long. And we're asking them everything that you can imagine that might influence health positively or negatively. And what our data is showing is that the more stressors that child has, the worse the health outcome is. So that total load theory is validated by this data. So that bucket, that barrel that we showed, that is what is happening. But there's also signal in the noise. So if you're collecting data on hundreds of variables in a child, so what kind of toothpaste they're using, and what kind of laundry detergent they're using, and whether their food is organic or not, and you're asking about whether they've had antibiotics or proton pump inhibitors and vaccines, like all these variables, how are you going to make sense of that, right? So we've used some machine learning tools to let the variables that are most important to determining children's health show themselves. And one of the things that we've concluded is that the stressor in modern America that has the greatest impact on health outcomes, either positively impacting them or negatively, is whether or not a child has had antibiotics exposures, and not just one round. We're talking about most kids in modern America have had multiple rounds of antibiotics for the strep throat and the ear infections and all the things that are sort of everyone believes are part of childhood. Like 100 years ago, people weren't trotting their kid to the pediatrician every time the kid spiked 100-degree fever or 99-degree fever. That's happening now, and these kids are getting antibiotics. So antibiotics are clearly showing themselves to be a major factor, or one of the major root causes in this chronic illness epidemic in our kids. And as Stephanie will probably talk about, there's lots of different types of antibiotics, right? There's the antibiotics like amoxicillin that you might get for that ear infection, but there's chemical antibiotics. Glyphosate is essentially an antibiotic. And we're talking about things that disrupt the gut bacteria. That is the biggest smoking gun if you're going to have to pick one. But again, there are kids who have autism who've never had an antibiotic, who've never had a vaccine. So how do you explain that? That comes back to total load. And what is in that child's multi-generational total load? You have to go back and look at mom. What was mom's health like? What was dad? How was dad contributing? It all.
Yeah. And consuming glyphosate every day, practically, which is an antibiotic.
I really perked up when you said antibiotics, because glyphosate disrupts the gut microbes in such a way that you get sick from pathogens, and then you take antibiotics to treat them. And so I think glyphosate could be a smoking gun behind those antibiotics that we're prescribing so many more, like urinary tract infection. Mm-hmm. I actually used to get urinary tract infections rather regularly, and I hated it because I'd always take all this cranberry juice and try to self-heal. Never worked, and finally break down, go to the doctor, get the antibiotic, and boom, it's gone. And it worked beautifully every time. Once I went organic, no more urinary tract infections, gone. And so I think glyphosate was the major player that was causing those. And then you take the antibiotic to treat it, and now you've got your gut microbiome even worse off than it was before. Mm-hmm. So it's a snowball
what's
effect.
Interesting about this antibiotic issue, Beth, and thank you, Stephanie, also is it only takes one dose of antibiotic to alter the microbiome for 6 months in a child. Mm-hmm. And so when you think about, we're giving these 10-day courses of antibiotics to get rid of strep or what have you, which we've just decimated the kids' microbiome. We also know, and Beth, you can go into this if you don't mind, and what you found from the CHIRP study is that the kids on the spectrum definitely have a significant dysbiosis with an overgrowth of certain pathogens, Clostridia, for example, which we found from the work of Dr. Monica Kruger back in 2013. She's a vet, that, chickens given glyphosate had an overgrowth of, Clostridia, and loss of beneficial bacteria like lactobacillus and bifidobacteria. So I'm curious if you saw anything in the CHIRP study that kind of supported that or not. That's something I'm interested in hearing about.
So we absolutely are seeing connection between neurodevelopmental conditions and autism being one, ADHD, learning conditions, PANS-PANDAS being sort of the neurobehavioral, neurodevelopmental category, and the antibiotics and the antibiotic exposure. We don't have any data on the actual constitution of the gut bacteria because it's a survey and it's not an objective microbial analysis. But there's so much medical literature out there that looks at the content of the gut of children with autism and how it differs from neurotypical children. But that's true also for, depression, anxiety, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. All of these conditions go back to the gut, and there's an imbalance in the gut. Overgrowth of Clostridia, overgrowth of Candida, overgrowth of Klebsiella. I mean, there's tons of baddies, right? But I think we're just at the very beginning of understanding what is happening in the gut. Dr. Sabine Hazen is a gastroenterologist in Southern California who is really diving into and sequencing the microbiome to understand, what is that? Is there some kind of footprint or blueprint that is reflected in the gut that results in Alzheimer's or results in autism? And what are the, what's the metabolome? What do the microbes in the gut produce that, impact your brain? What do they produce that is something you need to detoxify? There are these microbes, they're living organisms that, they eat stuff, and they poop stuff. That's another word, right? They create waste, and that waste, if they're out of balance in our body, we have to deal with their waste. It has to go through our detoxification channels. So the microbiome, again, like I said, we are just at the beginning of understanding what it's all about, its complexities, how it's impacting our health, how it's impacting our mental health. But I do think there are so many answers there. And, again, you can look at the kids who have had no antibiotics and eaten organic and have had less exposure to things that disrupt the gut, and they just do better. Health outcomes are just better. And that's evident in the CHIRP data for sure.
Can we, before we get into Stephanie and Michelle explaining really how glyphosate can cause autism, which I really want to hear about, Beth, can we just back up a little bit, and can you explain to the audience a little bit about this CHIRP study? We're all very familiar with it, but I think in the beginning I sort of failed to give a little bit more background about this CHIRP study. Can you say a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah.
The number of children that were surveyed, how long it took to survey, the intention of the survey. Can you say a little bit more about that, please?
Sure. So I've long known or suspected that that this epidemic of chronic conditions in our kids is a function of living in the modern world. Like, I think we all sort of know that at an intuitive level. And there's a lot of literature, like I said before, pointing to this chemical and its relationship to ADHD, or this chemical and its relationship to eczema, right? There's all these one thing looking at, one fatty and how it impacts symptoms and diagnoses. Plenty of literature on that, but no one's really looked at the totality of it. Like, how do these things act in concert? Is there synergies? What happens when they're cumulative? Like, people haven't really asked that question, I think, in a meaningful way. So we set out to try and ask that question. What is the impact of the totality of modern living on our children's little bodies? So we designed a study. It's called the CHIRP study, and it stands for Child Health Inventory for Resilience and Prevention, because we think if we can understand what these environmental factors are doing, we're going to be able to create more resilient children and prevent them from getting sick in the first place. So we decided that we needed to know how children in the modern world were living. So we sat down and it took us 2 years, and we consulted with over 40 different experts across different areas: toxicology, home building materials, nutrition. All these kinds of experts weighed in on what are the important factors that you know about in terms of supporting children's health or hurting children's health. So we made the most comprehensive questionnaire that I know of that looks at, again, how children are living in the modern world. It's only in the United States, sadly. I wish we had an international version, but every country is different, so you have to ask different sets of questions. So we built this survey. It takes the average parent between 2 and 6 hours to complete. We've had over 2,000 parents who've enrolled in the study, and we've downloaded about 500 completed surveys for analysis. And that's where when we've done that analysis and again applied these machine learning algorithms, we have been able to see the signal and the noise. Because doesn't it seem kind of crazy that you can make sense out of 900 plus variables in a child's life? It's actually more than that if you break down the questions. But these machine learning algorithms have allowed us to see what has the most impact, what variables are more important than other variables. And this whole concept of total load, again, has borne out. So the study's actually paused temporarily because we have to migrate it to a new software platform, but we hope to reopen it again and continue enrolling parents. And we've had all kinds of interesting things. We've had children with cancer enroll, autoimmune diseases, autism, and we've had super healthy children. We actually, at one point, tried to enroll a number of children in a Mennonite community to get their data, but that was exceedingly hard to do because they don't have computers. So, but that's still data we are interested in collecting as we relaunch the study again. And we hope to.
That's great. And Stephanie knows a lot about machine learning. She's actually an expert in AI and uses it to pull together the dots, pull together all those different dots on glyphosate and how it can cause autism. Stephanie, would you like to address that a little bit, seeing as that's our favorite topic?
Yeah, right. Yes. Well, it's exciting to me that new papers are coming out in the last few years linking glyphosate directly to autism, which is really, truly amazing. And we have this one, soluble epoxide hydrolase. Do you have something on that? Pop up that paper, Beth? Anne, I don't know. Yes. Well, we'll talk about this one first, because this one really excited me. I had been looking at, and I've talked about this before in this event, sulfotransferase defects associated with autism is something that Rosemary Waring had identified back in the 1990s. And I really picked up on that. Before I knew about glyphosate, I suspected there was a problem with sulfation pathways in autism. And this particular paper, which is 2021, actually looked at autistic kids and found out that they had severely defective sulfotransferase capabilities in the gut that would normally add sulfate to these phenolic compounds that are produced by things like Clostridia. So Clostridia produce these toxic phenols. The body knows how to stick a sulfate on there to make it water soluble, ship it off to the liver. The liver can then send it over to the kidneys and it can go out. If you can't make it water soluble, you've got a big problem, because that's when it becomes toxic. And so without those sulfation pathways, those phenolic compounds that are produced by those overgrown Clostridia species can cause nasty things in the brain. And so this says these findings suggest that maternal exposure to high levels of glyphosate, this is the glyphosate paper I was telling you about, and this one was in 2020, causes ASD-like behavioral abnormalities and abnormal composition of gut microbiota in juvenile offspring. And this is a mouse study. And that increased activity of this soluble epoxide hydrolase might play a role in autism-like behaviors in their offspring after maternal glyphosate exposure. So in utero, it was the exposure. The mother was exposed to the glyphosate. It caused this increase in this particular very interesting enzyme that I've looked at. And that enzyme, too much of that is linked to autism and linked to actually many other problems as well, many other kinds of neurological difficulties, like even Alzheimer's and things like Parkinson's disease. That particular molecule, it's an enzyme that's produced in the brain in excess in association with glyphosate exposure in this study. And interestingly enough, estrogen suppresses that enzyme, and glyphosate suppresses an enzyme called aromatase that converts testosterone to estrogen. So what is happening is too much testosterone in the brain is causing this developmental issues that's linked to this increase in this particular enzyme that causes damage that damages the brain. So it's really interesting, I think, to link all of that together with glyphosate. So I'm really excited to see these new papers that are showing direct links between glyphosate and cognitive issues, which is what I think is, gives you a much stronger case for arguing the autism link.
And we just
oh,
sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to real quick, Stephanie, would that explain why Bobby Kennedy has mentioned that he has seen in studies that girls with higher testosterone tend to be the ones with higher levels of autism? Would there be the testosterone link to that?
Absolutely. And in fact, there's another interesting study that just came out recently was on girl babies, a very a unique measure that they know about that can tell if they've been exposed to too much testosterone in utero. They measure what's called an anogenital distance, and you can kind of imagine what that might be. If that's too long, it's an indicator in a girl baby of excess testosterone exposure. And that particular feature is also linked to an increased risk to autism, increased risk to a polycystic ovary syndrome is called, which is a very common condition these days. And like 20%, huge numbers of people suffer from this PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome, which is associated again with this feature. When girls who have that feature at birth have a much higher risk of developing this problem, and this problem is also linked to fertility issues. And one of them, I think it's the most common cause of fertility issues in women, is this PCOS, which is linked to this problem that you see in the measurement, which is linked to the excess testosterone in utero, which then links to the aromatase deficiency that's caused by the glyphosate. So you can link all of those dots together and tell a pretty compelling story. Those women with PCOS also have a higher risk of having autism and a considerably higher risk of producing a child with autism. So that all connects together.
Didn't that study come from looking at the exposure of glyphosate in the maternal when the baby girl was in the womb? So
this was glyphosate exposure. That's right. They measured the glyphosate of the mother while she was pregnant. And then they looked at this measure, and they found that the girl babies, there was a statistically significant correlation between the problem with the girl babies and the glyphosate levels in the urine of the mother. Really, really interesting to connect. That particular dot is really, really important because that links all of that together.
Thank you.
And what's so shocking is, despite this knowledge that we have on glyphosate and harm and the causation, we're not talking correlation here. The epoxide hydrolase paper was a causation paper.
Exactly.
That we still cannot eliminate glyphosate from our children's diets, which is something that we've all been fighting, both, at the clinic front, the research front, and even at the legislative front, which we can even talk about as well. And we can't seem to move the needle on getting this banned. So we have the causes. We have the problem, we have the causes, we have the research, we have the data. We're trying to tell the legislators, but yet we still keep pouring into school lunches Thank you, Zen and Moms Across America. Where is the logic? You know, what has happened? What has side railed us from protecting our most vulnerable, our children? So this is why the new MDs, by the way, Beth, and inviting people like you, have gone directly to parents.
Mm-hmm.
This is indeed what we're doing. This community is going right to the source to tell parents, because somehow regulatory capture has prevented our legislators and others from telling parents how to prevent these major issues. And I think it's important to also, Beth, if you wouldn't mind sharing, that having a child on the spectrum, although some people call it neurodiversity now, and it's okay, but let's be clear that raising some children on the spectrum can be very challenging. Many of these kids do not sleep. They have dysomnias. And that is a key thing, because when children don't sleep, the whole family is sleep deprived. Number two, many of the kids on the spectrum are severely picky eaters. They have neurosensory issues with taste. And so you're running around like half of your day trying to get them to take one bite of food. I mean, there are ongoing daily challenges that these families deal with. I don't know why I'm getting off on this challenge, but people need to understand what it's like living with some children on the spectrum, especially those with more severe challenges, what it's like for families, the stresses it puts on the other children, not to mention parents, because parents of children with disability have a high rate of divorce. So that should be clear as well. So all these other factors come into play here. I know I'm kind of off on a million tangents here. I just want to throw those out there and open them up for comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where ultimately we're going to see the breakdown in society if we don't start doing something now. I mean, it is untenable for a parent to be able to hold a full-time job and parent a child with that level of special needs. And to have two income families where you have both parents working, you know, maybe there's some flexibility there, but so many of these families end up with a single parent who's working full time because of that divorce rate, like you talked about. It's extremely difficult for families to survive this way. How are we going to have a thriving society when we have this rate of disability in our population? And I think it's important to be very clear when you talk about the neurodiversity and how there is a normalization that's happening with autism. And I think it's commonly perceived that autism is just sort of part of the spectrum of normal human brain function. Well, what type of autism are we talking about here when you say something like that? The 10% that are independently living and high functioning, and that's a word that isn't even politically correct anymore. But what I'm talking about is like, you have autism that really truly is a spectrum. And the vast majority of these people do not have the capacity to be functioning members of society. So what do we do with that? How do we handle that as a society? I mean, that's an enormous investment of capital to care for people that we didn't have to do just 25 years ago, certainly not 50 years or 100 years ago. So I think we need to be talking about the impact that this is having economically, socially, culturally. It's totally changing us. And yet we're still sitting here being like, oh, it's normal. It's normal to think differently. Of course, it's normal to think differently. But what are we really even talking about here? Is neurodivergence just thinking differently? Or are these people suffering from sensory symptoms, from such severe social anxiety that they have to be medicated to get through the day? Are we talking about people who are adults who still don't have full control over their bowels? Like this is the where it gets muddy. And we cannot allow people to normalize the emergence of autism as neurodivergence. As much as we accept every single person, I don't want that to be misunderstood as not accepting and embracing people for who they are. Of course we are doing that. But we also need to understand that every person that has a diagnosis is suffering from these symptoms that you can turn around. You can overcome.
Yeah.
And that's not talked about.
And that's what's triggering, I think, for most of us. And as moms, doctors, and scientists working together, the intention of this show really is, to disrupt that pattern of a mom going into a doctor's office and a doctor telling her, your child's going to die if you don't vaccinate, or your child has to be on this psychotropic medication for the rest of his life, and not even talking about food, right? Not even asking, what are you feeding your child, whatever. So many doctors, Western medical doctors, have done that for so long. And then if a mom says, well, wait a second, what about the science that I now have access to, thanks to, all of these search engines, and bringing up science like Dr. Stephanie Seneff shows, and the doctor telling her, you don't have a degree, you don't know what you're talking about, and essentially one of them fires the other one. So talking about this, bringing this all together, that what happens there though is that the doctor often normalizes what's happening with the child, right, and says this is normal, and then what triggers the rest of us is that means nothing's going to be done about it.
Right.
And for us mothers, that is unacceptable, that nothing is going to be done about our child having their potential robbed from them because of this toxic overload of chemicals that they are being inundated by in our society. I mean, in the United States, we have 1,200 different endocrine disruptors that our kids are exposed to practically on a daily basis. It could be. And then in Europe, they allow 3. There's a slew of different types of artificial dyes and chemicals that are banned in Europe, but are allowed in the United States. And we don't want, this type of behavior to be normalized to take away, the action that needs to be done on behalf of our policymakers. And I saw one video that you talked about, Beth, which was, I thought, very important, was what if the CDC and our government just acknowledged that autism was correlated or caused by a toxic overload of chemicals, and we could actually do something about it? That brought up a very important point. I was like, wait a second. Yeah, our government's not even acknowledging that there is this problem and that it could be, curbed. It could be resolved. We could sort this out by not subjecting our kids to so many toxins. So can you say a little bit about the push to have the CDC acknowledge that autism is an environmentally impacted issue in the United States?
Yeah, and it isn't just autism. It's autism, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, depression, anxiety, life-threatening food allergies. It's all environmentally driven. Yet we are stuck in this cultural paradigm where we're like, oh, it's the genes. So if you end up with a diagnosis, the assumption is, well, you just have bad genes or it's bad luck. It's this genetic determinism, this idea that whatever you're presenting with in terms of your health is somehow a function of just only your genes. Are genes important? Of course they're important. But you cannot, with the volume of medical literature you all are very familiar with, you cannot deny the fact that the environment is playing on those genes and absolutely causing all of these conditions in children and adults. So, what all I was saying in that video that you're talking about, Zen, is that the CDC is towing the line of the narrative of the conventional medical community, which is, it's, when you go and get your diagnosis, we don't know what's causing this autoimmune disease. It's probably genetic. That's all you get. But what if we flipped the script and said, actually, your autoimmune disease, it was caused by the environment? Really, doctor? What in the environment? Well, it's the nutrition, it's the glyphosate, it's the chemicals. And then you as a patient said, oh, I had no idea. I need to change my life to overcome what caused this condition. And that is, to me, such an easy thing to do. It's an easy thing to do. The data is there. It's not controversial. So why can't we get medical authorities to start saying, yeah, I think the environment is causing this. Yeah, I think diet will really help. Why don't you try it? Right now, what you're hearing traditionally, and I do think it's changing in some places like your practice, Michelle, or functional medicine doctors will acknowledge that, you should change your diet. You should get glyphosate out of your diet. You should eat a nutrient-dense, ancestral-based whole foods diet. That stuff is starting to come out, but the vast majority, I think, of people are hearing still from their physicians that it's genetics. There's nothing you can do. You'll always be this way. Like, that's ridiculous. Like, we are so past that. We should just, I don't know how to make that happen.
You brought up so many good points there, Beth. And I mean, I think it's important for our listeners to hear that, autism, especially in not all kids, every kid is unique and individualized, is reversible, especially if you get it when children are younger. It's a reversible disorder. And this is where we veer off the mainstream narrative, because in mainstream medicine, they're not talking and they don't have the tools to reverse kids on the spectrum. And we have recovered many. I know you all here on this panel know that to be true. And there are ways that you do it. I mean, this is not unteachable. It's not unknowable. Once again, every kid's different. We also know there are certain children more vulnerable than others. That's clear because we know kids in the spectrum have methylation defects, like 90% of them. So we know some kids are more vulnerable than others. They can be screened before birth, actually, or during pregnancy or after birth to see which kids are more vulnerable, and they should be treated actually differently. So knowing that, what we need to be teaching parents is generally not that parents have to become their own super sleuths, which they all have had to do. Everyone's become their own CSI agent for autism, is how you reverse the process. Now, I don't know if we need to get into that here because we really wanted to focus on your project, documenting hope and stuff, but we can if you want to get into that, or just talk, maybe this ends a good time to pivot into our solutionary programs for, how we go forward now that we know so much of what Beth has shared. How do we move the needle?
And before we do that, I just want to say that this whole idea of whether it could be reversed was something that I was obsessed with when I first started studying autism. I didn't know. Is it possible? Are they permanently damaged, or is there hope? This whole question. And then when I realized I've met people who had recovered from autism, had like an 18-year-old girl, perfectly normal, had an autism diagnosis, gone on the organic diet, done all the right stuff, and she was fine. And that was so, I can still feel sort of shivers on my spine to think this is possible, that this is I think there's a strategy the body uses to shut the brain down in order to protect it. And it ends up preserving the capabilities of those neurons, waiting for the moment when this toxic exposure stops. And then all of a sudden you can pop right back out and be normal. It's just really, really gratifying. I'm sure it's not true for everybody. Some people have such severe damage they can't recover, but I think having that hope is really, really powerful. And I really appreciate that the body, I think, has done this kind of strategy to keep the brain safe by having it work less hard, to really kind of turn things off in order to not burn out the neurons in the situation where there are these toxins.
Yeah, and I also think it's important to say, like you said, Stephanie and Michelle, that every child is different. And there are some kids who really just are dealing with a total load every single day. That's too much. And when you reduce that total load, their body sort of recalibrates and reestablishes balance. And they have a very quick recovery. And I've seen that, things turning around in 9 months, a year, things like that. But then there are kids who also had so many assaults or hits during those critical developmental years that you actually have to do rehabilitation.
Yes.
So that's a real thing in autism recovery I want to talk about, because, I don't want to give people the sense that, like, oh, you get rid of organic diet, you get rid of the toxins, you're good. It's not as simple as that. That is the first step. That's the foundation. But a lot of kids who maybe, for instance, are non-speakers or who have really severe motor planning issues. Like there's pieces, I almost describe it as like having like a brownout in the brain. You have blackouts and brownouts of power, and you think about it that way. And that you need to get those parts of the brain back online. And you can do that. There's rehabilitative therapeutics. There's MNRI. There's rhythmic movement. There are all kinds of ways to reintegrate primary reflexes or primitive reflexes that might have been put offline during that developmental time period when they had an environmental assault. So I do think, as you're all saying, it's possible to reverse autism. There's hundreds of cases of people who've done it. We've documented them. We have some on film. We have some that we have written up on our websites. And there is, I believe, a way to heal, a process. It's going to be different for every person. It's bio-individual. And so that's what I think is the most important development in the last decade or so, is that we really are starting to treat these kids as bio-individuals instead of saying like, oh, there's a protocol to reverse autism. There isn't a protocol. It's just looking at the individual child and saying, okay, what's out of balance? In this kid, is it, what's out of balance in the gut? What's the nutritional deficiency look like? What are their individual SNPs, and how can we help support them? What do they need to do to detoxify? All those questions and all those answers are what gets a child to the place where they can function again, where they can thrive, where they can be healthy again. But again, it's different for every child. That's actually why we started documenting Hope, was because we had all these anecdotes of kids who'd recovered. And I remember starting this whole journey when I'd written my book and was starting to understand what was causing all these conditions. I also was talking to people who had fully reversed them. And I was blown away by that. I mean, I was blown away by the fact that you could have autism or Parkinson's or whatever it was, and you could reverse these things. When I learned that, I was like, how is this not common knowledge? How is this not taught at every single medical school? What is wrong with our system that this is not the standard of care? So that sort of set me on a tear. And I feel like we have, a lot of work to do to bring that out, but the knowledge is there. It's just bringing the knowledge out into the world. It's like, Michelle, you have this in your clinic, probably. You have the knowledge, you know how to help people do the work. It's just that it's not in the medical schools. It's not conventional. It's not what's offered to people. So that's why we do the work we do, though, is to bring that, success story, that recovery story out of the realm of anecdote into the realm of science and, inspire people to do this work because it's possible. It's absolutely possible.
Yeah. And speaking of science, I want to make sure we do show one of the studies and this could actually to not just explaining why autism has happened or contributing to autism, but preventing it. And that's the study about maternal glyphosate exposure causes autism-like behaviors in offspring through increased expression of soluble epoxide hydrolase. And what's important about this study is that when they, sorry, wait a second, I don't have it right in front of me, but that when the soluble epoxide hydrolase. Anyway, maybe Stephanie, you can explain this. I'm missing. There's one of it. Okay.
Yeah, well, we went through this before earlier in this show, so this was covered. But there's another study actually that showed correlations between glyphosate exposure and cognition issues, deafness, and depression, severe
That's
depression.
right, the most recent one in dementia and yes, depression.
Yeah,
covered that in the Alzheimer's.
Cognitive areas. Again, this is
the link between glyphosate and Alzheimer's in our last show, that a glyphosate, which is almost like an amino acid, is causative. There is one more thing I'd want to add. We talk about there, I just want to give some parents some hope here. Unless parents change their children's diet to organic, it's unlikely if you have any changes, it's going to be sustainable. And the other reason why that is so important, switching to organic, is I want to remind families that if you eat conventional foods, that the fertilizer they use on conventional foods is biosludge. Biosludge are human waste leftovers, and they have tons of pharmaceuticals that are not cleared from that sludge on the main food. So kids, in addition to all those things that we're talking about, are loaded with pharmaceuticals. Zen found that even in her school lunch study. So the key element, and when parents say, well, he's still eating Doritos, and it's like, it's not going to work. You've got to go organic. And the first step is removing the inflammatory foods, and that's gluten and dairy. So it's a rare
and sugar.
And sugars.
No Skittles for treats for kids with autism, please. I keep seeing that. It's just makes me.
You have to start with diet, and we could get into specifics, Beth, and we talked about individualized medicine. It's biomedically individualized, but there are certainly more inflammatory foods. So much has to do with what we've done to the foods themselves. But paleo type eating, keto forward, lots of veggies, lots of antioxidants, but you have to go organic. There's no way around it. And let's also be clear, it's glyphosate, Roundup is awful. There are at least 5 other pesticides per average food. GMOs are not benign in themselves. First study in GMOs showed harm without pesticides. So that's why you cannot go out and eat that chips and salsa at your favorite taco restaurant, or even if you're eating, let's say your favorite, perhaps Chinese takeout, if they're using GMO soy in the soy sauce. Because remember, the average American spends 46% of their income on takeout, eating out. And we're eating out. What are we eating out? I can't imagine. Even high-end restaurants don't serve organic. There has to be shift in the American cultural family landscape back to cooking and whole foods. Processed foods have got to go. Processed foods have substance in them, emulsifiers, carrageenan, and other things that destroy the microbiome. It's not just antibiotics. So when we go, I know so many holistic practitioners, lots of functional medicine physicians who don't discuss diet with their families, I'm like, how could you not discuss diet? You can't move past that. I can't do any interventions if we cannot make that position. So I can't say that enough. And if you look at people, if you take photographs of people's pantries, maybe not as organic as people think. We'll leave it at that. So
in 15 years I've been documenting stories of people who have overcome all kinds of chronic conditions, obviously children. I do not have one story of success that didn't involve diet change.
Me
And
too.
that
Me
is foundational. You have to do the diet. I mean, the thing is so crazy again, is like in modern America, we have become normalized to the eating out, to the processed foods, right? Such that people don't know how to cook anymore.
I know the young people are not bothering to learn how to cook, and the women are all have careers. You know, they've got lots of other things they want to be doing. They really we've been taught to try to minimize the amount of time we spend in the kitchen in order to have more time to do all these great things out in the world. And I think we need to change that message. We need to make it, and even to have the whole family involved in preparing the dinner. You know, really involve ourselves in the food that we eat, and make sure that and make a game out of maybe making it as healthy as it can possibly be, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I had a friend come over for dinner last night. We were doing a meeting here, and he brought me a bowl of garlic from his organic garden.
Nice.
And I was like, oh my God. It was like the best gift I could have received, you know, and I know the love and care he put into this garlic, but that's absolutely right. And as my own child has told me when I was trying to learn to ferment, like, Mom, YouTube it. Like, oh, like, how do I ferment? Like, everything's on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
There's no excuse, because every young family, everyone's got a phone. Everyone just can put up a video on how to make lentils, or, you know, how to do some of this cooking. So there has to be a will. But when you have a sick kid, many people wake up, unfortunately. And I'm sorry it has to be that, but sometimes that sick kid will turn the whole family around, and everyone gets healthier, including the child that's not doing well. So there are small blessings in this. I'm not wishing this on anybody. I don't want to get this misconstrued, but turning the whole family around. And I've had so many parents say, you know, I fixed my kid's diet. The whole family went gluten-free, dairy-free, and my asthma resolved.
Right.
Like,
yes. Yeah, I'm one of them too. My son had, when he was 8, he was diagnosed with autism-like symptoms, gut dysbiosis, 21 different food intolerances. You know, in 6 weeks, we did restore his gut, you know, with all kinds of different methods, but one of them was getting sugar completely out of his diet, going 100% organic, and probiotics and sauerkraut and all those types of things. And in 6 weeks, his autism symptoms resolved. And we did find glyphosate in his urine beforehand, and afterwards it was non-detectable. So for us, that was a major factor. And, you know, eating organic is, like you said, foundational, but it may not be the only thing people need to do, but it's a foundational thing for people to do. But you have a conference coming up, Beth, where you are going to be talking all about these different kinds of solutions. Can you tell us more about this conference, please?
Yeah. So one of the things that, you know, you're talking about as you are making diet changes, for instance, is, you know, you're teaching yourself something totally new. Like, you have to go to YouTube to learn. And it's not just diet. It's about, how do you create a home that's non-toxic? How do I find the therapies that are right for my child? There's, like, you can go to YouTube, you can look these things up, or you can come to a conference where we've already organized all the stuff and all the experts that are coming to teach you how to do these things. So we have a 3-day conference in Orlando. It's actually 2.5 days, November 10th through 12th. And we are featuring a wide variety of different speakers on different topics, all related to healing children. So, you know, if you wanted to say, how do I heal my child? How do I begin this process? Or even, how do I do the more advanced stuff? Like, I've done all the diet stuff. I've done all the, you know, detoxification in my home, but how do I do the rehabilitative therapies? We've got all of that covered. So Michelle, you're one of our speakers who'll be talking about homeopathy and home care, self-care in the home. But we have speakers on a whole bunch of different topics related to brain-body integration. Remember, I was talking about how kids have you know, rehabilitative work that's necessary, that's part of the process. So we have a couple different speakers that are talking about different therapies that help turn the brain back on, help light up that portion of the brain again. We have Chef Aaron Goldstein who's talking about how to cook food that's yummy and nutritious. We have vision. We have speakers on vision. We have speakers on dental health, oral health. You know, like, actually a lot of kids have very narrow airways due to sort of some structural issues that prevents their cells from getting oxygenated, that prevents their body from healing. So it's like, if you think about, you're on a healing journey, you want to learn the diet, you want to learn detoxification, but you also want to leave no stone unturned for your child. Like, what is the thing that my child needs? That's what we created in this conference, is a no stone unturned kind of approach where we cover all the different topics so that every parent's needs are going to be met if you're on this healing journey. And the best part for me is that this is about getting together in person as a community. So much of what happens in this healing journey is we do it by ourselves at home. We feel alone. We feel isolated. We feel like we're the only ones who are doing a gluten-free diet or not letting my kids have sugar. Here at the conference, everybody gets together. Everybody's doing the same stuff. We have a practitioner track and a parent track. So it's also an opportunity to go and talk to some of the practitioners. If you're a parent and you want to learn more, you can go grab one of the practitioners for lunch, which I think is kind of an exciting opportunity as well. So it's conference.documentinghope.com is where you can learn more about the speakers, topics, and what to expect.
And I want to say there's a parent track and also a professional track, right? You have two separate tracks. So if you're a professional, you can come and learn even more stuff, more
Exactly.
details.
Will there be online capacity for those who cannot attend in person?
So we will not record the whole thing for an online, but we will have some select videos available after the conference. But we really are encouraging people to come in person because, again, that everything in this post-COVID world is done isolated in our homes over Zoom. We really need to get together in person and hug, build our immune systems, and support each other, right? So I want people to show up. I want this to be a community that gets together year after year after year. Lifelong friends are made. You learn things from other parents. You learn things from practitioners that you happen to be talking to. So that's an important part to me, that we get everyone together in person.
I love that. I wish
Wonderful.
I could be there. I have a major fundraiser on the 10th. I'm so sorry. Otherwise I would be there. But one of my team members, Esther, is going to be there. And I'm so happy she's going to, bring back some information for the team and maybe one of our other team members as well. So we will be sharing it widely on Moms Across America and encouraging our supporters to go. There will be a link on our page on Moms Across America featuring the conference. And we hope that, everyone will be able to attend. We're so excited that you're doing this. So I really want to acknowledge you, Beth, for your dedication. I remember hearing about you doing this years and years. How many years have you been working on Documenting Hope now?
Well, I think I launched into this world in 2008, published my book in 2010. Documenting Hope came shortly after that, like 2012, 2013, something like that.
Yeah. So it was longer than I've been doing this. And I've been hearing, just the numerous stories that you've been sharing about children recovering. So you really you've been giving people hope for over a decade on this very difficult issue, and you've been sticking to it. And I can't imagine that it is easy because you come across so many people who are hopeless at a time, when their children are hitting themselves or breaking things in the house or, not able to go to the bathroom by themselves. I mean, they really are, many of these parents, rock bottom and most likely come to you and want support. So I want to thank you for your tenacity, for your generosity, for your, stick-to-itiveness, as Erin Brockovich would say, right? And for your generosity and, making this available to other people. Go to documentinghope.com. Go to the conference, Adventures in Healing, on November 10th and 12th. You can find all about it on documentinghope.com. Go to gmoscience.org, and you can go to stephanieseneff.net to find out more about her book, Toxic Legacy. Go to momsacrossamerica.org to find out more about all kinds of solutions and toxins, especially glyphosate. And we hope that you will, leave your comments and feedback and share this new MD show widely. We want people to know that we are working together. It's not just doctors telling parents what to do anymore. It's not just, scientists being paid to make the science come out a certain way. There are people who are honest, authentic, and who are working hard, and we are all working together to heal our families. So thank you so much for being with us today. We appreciate you very much. It's an honor to speak with such powerful and wonderful women. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And Beppy, I might wind up saying, yes, I will be speaking at the conference, but the truth be told is I get so much more than I give. And I am just so honored to be there and participate. That learning exchange is profound. I couldn't express it enough, what happens at the lecture and over meals. So thank you again. From all of us, we are thrilled. Thank you. Thank you for coming today.
My pleasure.
Wonderful.
Thank you for doing all the work you all do out in the world. You are a shining light for all of us.
Thank you.